John Ellersick, president of Next Rung Technology, as well as Josh Wimble, who's on the call joining him, I think principal engineer. And then on the other side of things, so John and Josh will talk to us about, all things scaling, commercial readiness, TEA, how all this fits together in one picture. And then it'll be great to have a follow-up presentation from Nicole and perhaps Amin. Nicole Blackstone is an assistant professor at Tufts University, and one of her expertise areas is life cycle assessment, and we'll be talking on the recent perspectives on that in the context of commercial readiness. So without further ado, I think we'll pass it over to John to kick things off for us.
Okay, and my question for you is, we use this as an opportunity to sort of generate our 2025 content on good practices in executing and scaling. Nicole, how much time should I plan on using? Because I've got a few slides.
I've also got a few slides. I was thinking we're divvying it up 50-50, John. So you've got half an hour for presentation and Q&A, and so do I.
Okay. Very good.
But if you go over a little bit, that's fine.
No. But I've got, I'm going to go fast. And I'll go real fast so that we have room to talk. I'm over here at MIT today. I'm going to try and share my screen. And you don't need to see that. Find my presentation. All right. So as I said, we're really excited about the chance to talk to you folks. So we put together a presentation called The Baker's Dozen. It's 12 takeaways from 12 first-of-a-kind pilot projects. There's a lot here, so I'll go quickly, and then even leave room for a follow-up someday. But as you all know, we have an excellent director of operations, Emma, who makes all our stuff fun and humorous. So we're going with a food and donut theme. In this 12 takeaways, we sort of put down 12 best practices. You can see we mapped out more time, but I will go fast, that we see people wanting to use or should be using in small pilot plant or first-of-a-kind project execution. So I think folks know us. We focus scaling sustainable emerging technologies, and fixing our food system is a big part of that. Do a lot of industrial bio and next generation foods and proteins. And I'll just say, we develop a lot of projects, which is why we have this sort of data set, and work with emerging technologies with, I would say, this toolkit of all the things that companies need to scale. So today I'll talk about a few of them. And I like this. This is our resume, I think, in the cellular ag and alt protein space. So we've done a few different types of technologies there. To start, what we like to do, instead of being sort of anecdotal in our stories, we also like to collect data as well. So we looked at, I think, more like 12 pilot plant projects and some first-of-a-kind scale-ups across these different data sets. That includes a bunch of food products, some cell ag, some plant cell ag, and other proteins, including stuff that we scaled out at the Kaplan lab with our friends at Tufts. We mapped a set of best practices, which I'll talk about as we go, against a set of things we thought represented good project outcomes. And then happy once we put all this data together to see that better outcomes correlated with better uses of best practices. But it is real data, and you can see that different projects have different outcomes. So here's where I'll ramp up. We divided this into 4 sections. I'll take 2, and Josh will take 2. If you've worked with us, you'll know that we spend a bunch of time working with our clients really to get in English language a charter, saying, what are we doing? Why are we building it? The charter is an executive of the organization, usually sponsoring executive, talking to the project team he's launching, and they're each saying back to each other, this is what I think you're heading off to do. And the other team says, yes, that's what we're heading off to do. Key items in here, I won't hit everything, is what's in scope and what's not in scope. And this is just the start, but doing a good charter was actually one of the top practices that correlated to good outcomes. Next, really talk about road mapping. This is for the company. It's thinking about all the threads of work that needs to be done. For pilot execution, What becomes especially important, and this is what it looks like when we do it, at least on a board, you can see this is a company actually in 2021, 22, 23. We're really mapping out what size of projects you should think about doing, why, and especially like who's going to use this. So this is a famous case in the mycelium space where we had done this is a 6,000 liter pilot, and then this is scaling all the way up to 145,000 square foot facility. And so that's the example of like chartering it out, mapping it, and then executing pilot, a demonstration, commercial scale. And then the last thing we do, I'll talk about, is think about customers. We're discovering for customers to, again, think about size. And the example I'm giving here, you see the donut factory. In a lot of pilot plants, a real thing that people find is it's been planned for technical reasons or maybe for regulatory reasons, and they miss some of the uses. In particular, in this example, we talked about when we were launching it that the CEO of the company was likely going to use the fats and oils they produce someday, promise their board of directors donuts made with their own fats and oils. And in this situation, a lot of times pilot plants end up working 24/7 for months, simply producing small amounts of product to be given to important stakeholders as they come through, who usually take a bite, put it down, and say, hey, that was pretty good. So we think about all those things when launching a pilot plant. I'll hit the next one, which is design and development. Understanding where you are, technology readiness. This is actually good best practice. We even pulled over from the Department of Energy. It's got knowing that instead of a single point of design, you might start here today, in 2 years to be in a different place. And understanding that whole variability is key, both to successful plant design, but it's got a real organizational health element to it, where the technical team understands that their data has been heard and organized, and the business team understands that their vision has been captured as well. And those are both accommodated in plant design. We came up with a name for this. It's called designing for day one and year two. A lot of the reality is this is sort of where the technical team thinks they are today. And this is where the business case wants to be in the future. And understanding both those things is really a key point for first of a kind scale-ups of any type. So we call that day one and year two. And then the last one I'll mention here and then throw it over to Josh is there is a sort of structured process that the industry uses to scope out projects. It's cyclical with stage gates. You get really quickly, if you do an FEL01, all of the equipment you'll have, cost, space you'll need, utilities, and that's a site selection package. We do this as an intervention quite often for folks who've gotten a pilot plant. They've gotten a facility before they've decided what's in it. So that is, I think, the first half dozen of our best practices. Go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, thanks. I'll pick it up there. I've got a few. I'll just list them at the top, but basically I'll take you through sort of form over function, the management of trade-offs in design and execution, and then sort of maintaining optionality through the design and construction process. I think just like a small amount of background, I won't spend much time on it, but so prior to joining Next Rung, I came from a startup down in Boston, Mori, that was developing silk-based food coatings for shelf life extension, where I was the senior director of manufacturing, helping stand up their first pilot plant, which is how I met Next Rung, because we did all of the design for that pilot plant through commissioning and startup. But one of the things I think people should sort of recognize about startups and first of a kind plants generally is this sort of idea about show horse and workhorse, right? Everybody, I think, starts developing a pilot plant for one set of reasons and often ends up in a different set of reasons as soon as the first equipment is turned on. And commonly you're building the facility for customer sampling, you're building it for process development, and then immediately upon completion, you realize all of your customers are internal and stakeholders need as much of this stuff as anybody else, which leads to some of the challenges John talked about. But I think ultimately the idea of this show horse versus workhorse is to be clear about the intentions and uses of the facility from the very beginning through chartering, so that everybody who's involved from the people working on process development through the board level really understand what the goals are, so you can drive clear alignment and keep people on track about what it is you're trying to do. So I think we have some good examples of the show horse versus workhorse problem in facilities that we have been brought into and are often helping navigate this with clients, because ultimately it is important that companies can point to a nice looking pilot plant and it's a piece that is useful beyond just the process development and the customer sampling. So there's a balance here that needs to be struck, and I think getting this right during chartering and really providing a plant which is functional and doesn't have, say, glass walls from floor to ceiling, making it impossible to mount pipe racks to anything, get really sort of an important lesson learned from a lot of projects here. And then I think to the form versus function piece, we think a lot about the size of plants. I think everybody starts with a clear vision for how big something needs to be that often isn't founded in something that supports the business. The picture we have here, and I think on the next slide as well. Yep. Back one slide. Yeah, this one. So this is an example of a plant that ended up about 50% larger than it needed to be. There's John in the middle with more of our team as we visited that site after it had been mothballed, but I'll let John talk about that a little bit more later. But ultimately, this is a plant that ended up being pushed to be 50% larger than it needed to be so that it could be the largest plant of its kind in the world. So it was largely a decision not made based on the fundamental economics or the real need to demonstrate technical advances, and was ultimately 50% more expensive to run when you're producing off quality material, and ended up being a significant challenge for the company because of the sort of decision to prioritize form over function in this case, to be able to say it was the biggest. So the next point I'll talk a little bit about is sort of like wrapped up in project execution, and it's about managing trade-offs through design and facility construction. I think everybody has seen this good, fast, and cheap adage, and you only get to pick two, but I think in reality, we think about this as a more complex space with more trade-offs to be made. We have these six that we commonly think about: scope, schedule, budget, quality, resources, and risk, that ultimately are all levers for achieving the outcomes that you want in a project. I think, like easy to understand examples is like managing scope through a project to keep budget in check. And if you have budget constraints, you can sacrifice on scope or value engineer, as some like to call it, to keep this on track. But ultimately, these are all levers that interplay in some way, right? The quality and risk aspect is sort of broader as well. Like we could think about doing work with contract manufacturers, which brings a lot of additional quality challenges and ultimately like impacts the resource profile that you need to execute projects. So these are all interrelated, and I think one of the best practices that we identified is sort of clear understanding of the trade-offs and management of these trade-offs through the life of the project, through project execution. So this is another good example. It's on its own, it's an anecdote, but in the full table John has, I guess it makes it data. So this is an example of a facility that we helped. It's the mycelium facility that John mentioned earlier, where we did early conceptual design and then stayed on the project as owner's engineer through startup of this plant, and have continued to be involved with the customer for some time. The things we wanted to sort of highlight through this is the development of good RFPs and maintaining optionality for the owners through the project. Early on here, we recognized one of the challenges with working at startup scale and pilot plants is that these are often small projects for very large engineering companies, and it can be challenging for somebody that has 20 people to get good treatment by a 20,000 person architecture and engineering firm. So we were really focused with this client on maintaining optionality throughout the course of the project so that we could make changes to the architecture and engineering firm or the people doing the construction as we needed throughout the project. And one of the ways we did that was by sort of fast tracking and owning procurement so that we had plenty of time to do good RFP development, good outreach, good architecture and engineering firm selection, and really decouple the schedule in a way that allowed us to keep moving forward while still providing this optionality and sticking to a schedule for the client. So I think the end result of like sort of good schedule management and good execution was that we were able to keep this optionality when we ran into issues with the engineering company, and ultimately like provide them a lot of options through the course of the project so that they can move those 6 levers and get things done the way that they need to.
All right. And I'll hop back in. So we had the last sort of a set in our Baker's dozen was just some ideas you may have seen a little bit before for the industry. One is that really any facility, I know Tufts is thinking about this as well, about 70% of the development costs, project costs, are really unrelated to the core technology. And if you think about this is why CMOs and co-mans really are putting the structure around a company's individual technology. So we really think there's a lot of opportunities for the cellular ag industry to do shared facilities or scale up pilot facilities. I know many of those are in the works. Secondly, for this industry and for other industries, I had somebody in a different bio industry talking to me about this week. You can get in the place where one portion of your technology is not really just ready to scale up, scale in size, which captures economy scales, but really is only ready to scale out. And the classic one for cellular ag is the reactors, right? The bioreactors. So we were looking at this, that where, let's say 10% of a technology on a capital cost basis is not ready to scale up yet. Map this out a little bit, and because the capital costs are really tend to be about 20 to 40% of COGS at scale, you can even accomplish up 5 or 10 times scale up in capacity and size, which may be important for developing markets, without some core parts of the technology being ready to scale up and being just simply duplicated there. And at the end of the day, you might only end up with about a 10% impact on cost of goods, which may be acceptable to achieve rapid scaling of other elements you have to do for business. And finally, this is a little data we used all last year. It's about capital discipline and the time it takes for project execution. This was a different data set of about 100 projects, but we had looked at the time the best performers, the 10th best performers of successful companies took to scale. And that was about 7 years, which is really, so hitting the 10th percentile 5 times in a row. It's hard to do. But this is also the venture capital fast or medium duration money's expectations. In practice, and this is really relevant for where I am today at the commercializing industrial bio, the median for people who are successful moving through these stages is 12 years or more. And the longer run is of successful companies is up to 90th percentile. And here where we are today, for instance, it's 2025, and a lot of the bioindustrial, commercial industrial bio really started getting going in the year 2000. And there's companies here building plant 2 just today who are considered the leaders in the field. So this is not the initial expectations for cellular ag, but that's sort of where it is. So that's our Baker's dozen.
Hey, John, I may add too, because there was a great session yesterday with a lot of very experienced people on a panel talking about commercializing industrial biotech, and the capital discipline topic came up there as well. And the sort of message from people who've been doing this for anywhere between 25 and 40 years was that capital discipline is important in lean times and also times with plenty of money. So thinking about those realistic timelines that are 12 to 20 plus years long means that the capital, first, their recommendation was to take it early and often when it's available, and then make it last while you can.
Yep.
Sort of the overall message there.
Yep. Very, very, very true, Josh. And then we threw, because we have a bunch more best practices, we threw them in there as lagniappe because this is a Baker's dozen. and that was quickly, we would be remiss not to mention the value of technical economic analysis in charting your course here, both for technology and for capital projects. In risk management, which some folks, both of these things sometimes people think are perfunctory, but they really are important, not only for successfully scaling, but for the organizational health elements of letting people be heard, letting people say, I'm worried about these risks. They have these impacts on cost, schedule, and they've got these probabilities. And how are we going to mitigate them? And if this is done at a high level and a low level throughout project execution, it really helps achieve success. And I'll note also, at times you will accept risk. And that's okay if you acknowledge it as very strong for organizational. So just looping back to wrap this up, we took that set of best practices, sort of normalized their use on a scale of 0 to 10 and normalized project outcomes. And so for our project outcomes, we assessed as within budget, within schedule, when the final project was launched, plants achieving functionality. Positive outcomes include rescoped and completed and success of the company business line. The neutral ones were not yet launched or not yet completed. We feel it's okay to not do the wrong project. And the bad outcomes were the business line canceled or the business itself did not succeed. And so when we looked at that, then individually you can see sort of the best practices, the most frequent ones we saw being used. And again, these were our clients, so we made sure they charted things. They paid attention to that function versus form, and they performed those initial analyses to get the site right. When we looked at what were the most impactful best projects to use, so what we're doing here is we're seeing who used them and what their project rating outcomes were. Roadmaps, customer assessment, and technology readiness were the top ones. And again, the recurring theme is the importance of launching smartly and well and measuring twice before moving forward. And our boxes are hopping over here a little bit. Sorry about that. The final one is the converse, when practices were not used, which had the worst outcomes. And you can see that the most impactful practices not to follow was chartering the FEL one for site selection and guiding everything with the TEA. So I think that's our presentation. We left 10% of the time for questions. And let me stop sharing my screen.
That was beautiful. Thank you so much for the presentation. I will hold off on my questions I have. I see Paul has his hand raised. Is that a hand raise or is that a clapping?
Yeah, no, it's a hand raise, I guess.
You want to kick us off?
Yeah, thank you, man. Thank you for the presentation. That was really nice. I have two questions, actually. One is, do you see any difference in applying these methodologies from one region to another because the authorities and the compliance to the local rules may vary, so maybe you need to adapt. So that's my first. And then second, when you were saying that for an OEM, 70% of their CapEx needs to fit many clients, do you see any impact when a product needs to be food grade as compared to pharma grade? And how is this OEM adapting to these requirements as well?
Oh, cool. Okay. Regionally, I would say if you get a chance to look at the slides later, in the road mapping, there's a whole regulatory and customer element to it. So I think that is where region, as in country or EU acceptance, comes into play, and as well as, again, customer acceptance and regulations. For the food question, I'll throw it to Josh if he's there, because he handles all our food GMP stuff.
Yeah, I think like there are notable differences operating in the two spaces. I think what a lot of people in cellular ag spaces or novel protein spaces are dealing with on the compliance side is like initial GRAS notifications and sort of like regulatory acceptance in areas that is a little bit outside of what we identified here for pilot plants, and often follows a much different, much longer, torturous route, as you probably know. I think while I was at Maury, we were in the process of wrapping up our GRAS submissions and getting our no questions asked letter, and like the regulatory compliance strategy is complex, right? It's about like, in that case, we were trying to use silk as a food additive, and it's about identifying areas of the world where there's historical use, and you can point to these. It's about developing your own studies for safety and use. So the regulatory aspects are complex, and I think when it comes to actually building the plants, luckily they're a lot closer, right? So the FDA and the FSA have different versions of ultimately the same type of requirements, right? Like process equipment needs to be fully drainable and cleanable. So on the actual steel in the ground perspective, the best practices we talked about today are not fundamentally different, but I think the regulatory and compliance pieces look much different, and it's work done by people that I think are much smarter than me in those areas, frankly.
And just a further comment, maybe having done several of these, including probably one of the largest and some of the smaller ones, learnings of the industry. One of them was finding the right level of sterility, and higher levels of sterility ended up being required than people thought might be needed, I would say, is the first one. The second one is in the States, there tends to be a USDA and an FDA section to these facilities that have two sets of rules. One that sort of reflects, I may not say this right, pharma-ish higher sterility processes, and one that reflects food processes, which is sort of, you're making hamburger, someday steak. So individual depends on location. And I think it's maturing everywhere, at least in the States. The understanding of this stuff is maturing.
Yeah, I mean, maybe in the way of anecdote, right? I spent a good chunk of 2022 and 2023 in California working on a pretty large pilot plant for cultivated beef. And at that time, like the world still didn't know, like, are we talking to Cedar at the FDA? Are we talking to CBER for the fermentation side? Where does the USDA like take precedence, and like how are we creating a separate space that is a meat packing plant right within this FDA regulated facility? But now like people are doing this, and there's a lot more clarity around who sort of the authority having jurisdiction is in each areas, and sort of overall strategy. So it's becoming more clear, and in a much better place than it was even 2 or 3 years ago.
Beautiful. So we started a little late. I don't know if there's one last burning question. Otherwise, we're going to end up passing it over to Nicole. And then we might have some time at the end for general Q&A. But maybe I have a burning question in me if others don't then, which is really like, I think what was interesting to me is, the way you're talking about I guess this is maybe a question for both of you, but from Josh's slides where you had the cheap, good, fast sort of thing, and then saying, okay, we need to expand that to 6. I feel like what we were just focused on right now is the quality lever of that. So of the 6, I'm kind of curious in general where it's hardest to actually work with a lever. So you have like these 6 levers, and I don't know if it comes from like the operational side, like convincing somebody they need to do a risk assessment, or if there's just something that no matter how prepared they are, this is the lever that is going to be the hardest to work with someone on. So
it's nice to, like we just try and expand this discussion beyond good, fast, cheap. And right, scope, schedule, budget, risk, resources, quality. You can throw more resources at a problem and make it go faster, right? Risk would be is maybe sounds less acceptable in this context. So it doesn't mean that you use it necessarily. I think you're thinking food safety and quality. But for instance, even the level of on quality, the level of wash down, it's really important that you understand you're not making a pharma facility. You're making a food facility. And so that's one of the quality questions. And maybe I'll let Josh talk about a risk question.
Yeah, I think generally in scaling first of a kind technologies and cellular ag in particular, people have rightfully been extremely risk averse over the past decade, right? I think open questions around regulatory jurisdiction and customer acceptance and ability to operate in places has led people to really build state-of-the-art facilities that look more like pharmaceutical manufacturing than they do food plants. And I think that was right at the time. But I think we're sort of entering into a world if we look at who's survived and who's out of business, I think a big part of what we see is the companies started and run by scientists who wanted to build sterile bioreactors similar to what you'd use for T cells are dropping off, and we're starting to see the people survive that are focused on capital discipline, understand risk management in a way that you need to operate in a space where you're ultimately trying to compete against commodity priced meats. So I think the industry, from what we've seen, started extremely risk averse, and I think the people that are winning today are those that have sort of right sized the level of risk taking with where the market is now and where they expect to see it in the future. So continues to evolve.
That's really interesting. Thanks. That's a really insightful point. I appreciate that. And with that, I think we'll close this Q&A session and move on to Nicole's portion of today's event.
Yes, and of course I need to
Okay.
find time. Okay. All right. Thank you. Apologies for the delay on this, and thank you, Matt, for advancing slides.
Of course.
I'm Nicole Blackstone. I'm an associate professor at the Friedman School here at Tufts. I'm a sustainability scientist by training, so my work focuses on environmental and social impacts of different food systems, including cellular agriculture. But I have an asterisk here because all of my work to date has been specifically on cultivated meat. And so my remarks really focus on the life cycle assessment work that we are doing in that space. But a lot of the concepts we're talking about apply more broadly to cell ag. Next slide. Okay, so I'm assuming that folks are at least familiar with the concept of life cycle assessment. Matt, you can click. Life cycle assessment is a tool that we can use to understand the sustainability performance of systems. So most commonly applied as environmental life cycle assessment, but there are also social life cycle assessment approaches, which I will talk a very small bit about at the end. But this is a tool that lets us essentially benchmark and assess our systems. Next slide. So common applications of LCA, which I think are important to talk about in the context of commercial readiness, because LCA can be used in different ways. So LCA can be used from the very beginning as part of a green design process, also to drive product innovation. So thinking about when you're thinking about product development or product, redevelopment, LCA can be used as a tool to help guide that process, along with other strategies like Josh and John were talking about. LCA is also used for business strategy. So how can things like the carbon footprint of our products or of our organization guide strategy for the business at large? A very common application of LCA is for marketing and public claims. So you will often see companies coming out with what would be called ISO verified critical reviews, where they've done a comparative life cycle assessment and they want to make a public claim about the environmental superiority of their product. And then also to guide public policy, which is admittedly much more widespread in the EU than it is in the United States. Next slide. So I mentioned that LCA can be used as a part of kind of a product assessment, product innovation. For cultivated meat, there have only been 7 published life cycle assessments of cultivated meat. The results of these you'll see here in terms of carbon footprint. So what we know about cultivated meat to date is that there is a lot of variability in the potential environmental impacts that these systems can have. And the different studies you're looking at here have had a variety of scales that have been assessed, timeframes that have been assessed, technologies that have been assessed, that's leading to a lot of different noise in the numbers. Next slide. But even though there's a lot of noise, we've still been able to learn a lot about what our drivers of impact or hotspots are in these systems, so that we know, for example, that the use of media, the composition of the media, the level of purity and the ingredients used in the media, those are major drivers of impact for these systems. We know that your grid mix for your plant is going to really drive, especially for carbon, is going to really drive environmental impacts, and then how efficiently you're using both the electricity and the fuels on site. And then finally, kind of adding on to what John and Josh were saying, your system scale and design not only affect your costs, right? They affect your environmental performance. So a great example of how this can really significantly affect environmental performance is whether you have any degree of circularity in your systems. That is going to reduce footprints by varying degrees depending on how the system's designed. Next slide. So just some, so appreciate John and Josh's remarks coming before mine, because like very concrete, boots on the ground. Mine's a little bit more abstract, but I wanted to lay out kind of some of the challenges that we as LCA practitioners face in partnering with industry to try to understand the impacts of these systems. One is that, we're talking about an emerging technology, and we could be modeling the impact of that technology at different scales, but how you build and model the system for a lab scale tech is very different than for commercial scale. The timeframes that you're looking at. So some of these studies we're doing, we're actually trying to project out into the future what a commercial scale plant, the impacts would be into the future. And that can affect the assumptions that you make about the electricity that's used, how efficient things are, et cetera. That really affects your model, where plants are located, and the technologies that are used. Compounding onto this is that, like, as an LCA practitioner, you probably don't have access to primary data that's going to represent commercial scale activities. So there needs to be some degree of simulation, which really kind of aligns very well with what Josh and John were talking about with techno-economic analyses. So we have folks who do LCA who are like, how do I do an LCA of this system? They may not also do TEA. So we need more and more partnerships in this space between the folks that do the techno-economic work and process simulation and life cycle assessment. Another big challenge, and I wanted to just raise this up to this group, is that a lot of the data that we need to use for high quality LCAs of these systems just don't exist. And so I think there's a really important role for industry, both kind of on the input side and on the manufacturing side, for collaboration and thinking about how data can be aggregated and shared to support more robust LCAs of the sector. Next slide. So there are a bunch of challenges. I wanted to preview to you all some guidance that's going to be coming out. Technical guidance supporting LCAs for cultivated meat. This is the result of a collaboration between myself and Hanna Tuomisto at the University of Helsinki. We've been kind of convening an expert working group for over a year now, and we're at the point where we're going to be submitting these proposed guidelines for peer review in a journal, and then they'll be available to the field. Next slide. But I wanted to give you all an idea, and I apologize, this is a little bit blurry, of kind of where we're missing critical data to support really high quality studies for, in this case, for cultivated meat, but this can be applied to anywhere where you're using media, right, to grow products. So this table shows areas where we either don't have any data, or we have proxy data available to represent the production processes of these different media ingredients. So it's across the categories of the types of ingredients that we use for media. We're missing a lot of data, and we have proxies in many cases, but not all. So this is a really important area to be supporting, good decision making and commercialization. We need some better collaborations to be filling some of these data gaps. Next slide. So building on what John and Josh were talking about in terms of like the work that they're doing on supporting companies and getting to scale, a lot of the kinds of questions that you all are thinking about, I think, align really well with what we've been grappling with as LCA practitioners and what we're starting to recommend to folks in scoping out good quality LCAs for cultivated meat. But honestly, this would also apply to any cellular agriculture technologies. When these studies are being designed, like as practitioners, it should be really clear what the time frame is. So is it are you doing kind of looking at historical data or a current plant, or is this a future oriented study where you're sort of imagining what a commercial scale plant might look like 10 years from now under very different operating conditions? How mature is the technology that you're studying? So we are recommending that TRL or MRL or bio-MRL, since a biomanufacturing process, should be specified if possible. Though, to John's point, this requires a formal TRA or MRA to actually assess, and that's a really complicated process that most LCA practitioners are not capable of doing or not set up to do. So if that's not available, at least the maturity of the technology should be specified qualitatively. Like you need to talk about where it is in terms of scale and production environment, thinking about even just production volume per batch and bioreactor size, and whether what you're looking at, the data you're using, are sort of actual data or is it simulated data? That's really important to be clear about. And then we've also got some guidance on how to do high quality comparisons or comparative assertions. A comparison is when you're just comparing, for example, one environmental indicator like carbon footprint or water footprint. And a comparative assertion is when you want to say this product is overall superior to another product in terms of sustainability. Oh, next slide, Matt. And so I wanted to, I'll share a little bit of this guidance on comparisons and comparative assertions, because as I mentioned, this is one of the most common applications for LCA, I would say, for companies. And so when our guidance is that when this is being applied to try to compare against other products, since we are comparing across products with different technology levels, like the comparisons need to be made with caution. And our advice is that when you are doing an analysis of a lab or a pilot scale system, you could be comparing with more technologically mature systems for things like benchmarking, setting targets, other activities that support green design. So if you want to compare your, very small pilot scale cultivated beef with beef, right? Then this is the neighborhood that we would want you in. We want you to thinking about it as benchmarking, target setting, green design. It's probably internal only. You probably don't want that out in the world, but maybe you do. The other kind of set of comparisons is you can take your data from your lab or your pilot scale system to do process simulation, techno-economic analysis, and also that all of that data can be sort of plugged into a life cycle assessment, right? So you can do the simulated commercial scale process, do the LCA, and then that's a fair comparison between a higher technology maturity system that would be able to support a public assertion, essentially. And that can be really important in the commercialization journey. Go ahead, Matt, keep going. I'll talk a little bit. So this is some of the work that my group does on this harmonization front. I'll go very quickly and talk about our other work, specifically with cultivated meat and LCA, and how we think about that supporting commercial readiness. Next slide. So we do work at sort of the lab scale just because we are collaborating with a ton of different labs across North America. And so we've done lab scale analyses that we kind of think about them as supporting green design. We've done studies of media ingredients, scaffolds. Amin has led really interesting work on multi-objective optimization, where we are using AI to be balancing across normally competing objectives, cell growth, cost, carbon footprint, or environmental outcomes. We've done that at the lab scale, but we have kind of emerging work where we're hoping to do that more at the commercial scale as well. Next slide. And then we have analyses where we're looking at the sustainability of kind of simulated commercial scale systems. So there's a QR code here. We have a published LCA on serum-free media. This kind of shows the impact of innovation, how innovation can really advance sustainability and reduce costs. That's a serum-free media formulation that was developed here out of Tufts, BPR, for bovine cell culture. And then we also have studies that we work on just for the products themselves. So we have a life cycle assessment of commercial scale cultivated chicken that's in development, and also for cultivated beef in the United States. Next slide. I'm gonna go really fast on this and just make a remark, and then we can skip to the end. So I've been talking about environmental LCA. I think it's also really critical in terms of not necessarily technical commercial readiness, but social acceptance and navigating a very complex political environment to additionally try to understand and quantify the potential social impacts and benefits of these technologies. And so most of the research that's been done to date has been kind of surveys or interviews focused on politicians, executives, funders, but we are pretty certain that small farmers and waged hourly workers are the most likely to be affected potentially by the development of this tech. Some folks have done studies with farmers in the UK and Finland. Next slide. Next slide. But I'll share that we're doing some work here in the US on the social implications of cell ag, specifically doing surveys, doing interviews, doing that on the ground work, but also trying to apply a social life cycle assessment method to it so we can understand the potential impacts of this technology along the value chain, including kind of knock-on effects for affected stakeholders. And I think in this moment, in this political moment, I would argue that this is just as important from a just kind of public acceptance perspective to be thinking about as well. Last slide. Okay, so just high level conclusions. LCA can and is being used to support sustainable commercialization. We need better data, better models, more collaboration across the researchers and industry, et cetera, to keep that work advancing. Social performance, we can use SLCA here as well, but work is very early stage. I think it's really critical to be doing that kind of engagement with conventional and traditional agriculture to support public acceptance of the products broadly, not just in kind of smaller niches of society. And I'll stop there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nicole.
Yeah.
Really appreciate that. I will personally have to leave in 2 minutes. I have another meeting after this. But do we have any time for maybe one question?
I have a question. If just very briefly, Nicole, you can talk a little bit about, like what are the things that you think a social analysis could sort of like could help the industry with? Like, what kind of aspects do you see? Is it job creation, or like what are we talking about?
Yeah, so when we talk about social impacts, we're thinking about different groups of stakeholders along the value chain that might be affected. So primary groups we would be thinking about would be like workers, local along the value chain, right? Local communities, rural communities, and farmers. We can also think about kind of broader societal impacts on markets and fair competition, et cetera. But I think the real value add is on the sort of worker side and workforce development, the potential development of higher quality, higher paying jobs, that sort of thing. So I really think there's a lot of potential in better understanding that, and understanding that not only is this we need to think about it along the value chain, but we also need to be thinking about it, how this plays out in space and across different communities, because if the technology gets developed in high income urban areas, then you have a kind of a scenario where those good jobs are not being located in the communities where jobs are being taken. So I think that's another thing to be considering, like plant siting. Does that change folks' perspectives on it? Is this something that they would see as valuable in their community? Those sorts of considerations we can all kind of think of and try to quantify with social CA.
Okay, super interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
Awesome. One thing I can say is when I think I'm seeing some companies start to put into their broader impacts their site location. And so starting to actually dig into that, which is really cool to see. And I feel like the work that you're doing, Nicole, will plug in perfectly with those efforts to help them understand how to do that best. But I think we're at time now. I do have to hop off. If anybody, it sounds like Nicole has to go as well. So maybe it's worth just calling it here. But thank you all for your time. John,
Thank you, everyone.
Nicole, thank you.
Thank you
Of
so
course.
much for a good
Bye-bye.
webinar.
Thank you.
See you. Nice to meet you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.